Let's stitch up these cute Halloween designs, but change them from pillows to a mini quilt. I've opened my Embrilliance Essential Software and I am going to work on some files that I got from My Girlfriends Quilt Shoppe. It's these 3 files that I want to make into a quilt instead of little pillows. So the file that I got, they're called bowl fillers, but they have an envelope backing. And so when this design is put together, the backing is sewn on, all of it's done in the hoop. You turn them inside out and you stuff them, and they become these little pillows. But I wanted to, again, make a little mini quilt. And so I made this mini quilt with these designs. I love it and I can't wait to share it. But there's some changes that I need to make because these are not regular blocks. They are the little pillows. So let me show you how I've had to adjust them so that I can make that into a little wall hanging. So the first thing I needed to do was find an additional design because I only had 3 and I needed an extra one. So I chose this little owl cloche from the Pumpkins and Potions quilt, which is one of my favorite from that ladder quilt, and I brought that in. Now, when I select this block is trimmed to 6.5 by 6.5, which means that it will be a 6-inch finished block when it's sewn together. So I need to make some adjustments so that these don't have the envelope backing and that they are sized right so that when my quilt is finished, I have a square quilt. This is how my designs will end up, but let me show you how they are designed now and kind of explain the changes that I need to do. So I'm going to go to a new page so that we have it not quite so many items, and I am going to open this skull first, since these 2 have borders and they are going to be a little bit more involved, or just a couple of steps extra that I'll have to do to get these prepared. So if I look at this skull design, there is a placement for the batting. There is a tack down of the batting, and then over that same tack down, there is the tack down of the fabric. Then it will, do things like the background quilting. It will do all of the applique just like a normal block. Then the very last step is one more outline. All of those outlines have been in the exact same place, and this would be for the envelope backing. You would place the fabric, sew around it. There's 2 pieces of fabric, and then you would take it out of the hoop and it could be turned inside out. So right off the bat, I do not need this last step because I'm not doing an envelope backing. You can see that on my quilt right now, I just have the back, I have the batting and the stabilizer, and I'm getting ready to put the backing on. So I don't need this last step. So again, the first thing I'm going to do is select that on the right hand side. It's the very last step, and I am going to delete it. So now I have the steps that I need, but I'm going to make, in the skull block case, I'm going to make one adjustment. So after the placement and tack down of the batting, I would place the fabric. If you've seen any of my Kimberbell, this is, essentially the same thing. Place the fabric, and then it does a tack down. But I don't want my tack down this exact same size. I need it to be larger so that it will include a seam allowance. If I leave the tack down at exactly where it is and I trim outside and then sew basically on this line, if I'm not exact, or if my seam allowance is not exact, when I flip that block open, I might see that stitching, and I don't want to see that. So I am going to enlarge this so it looks more like the owl block You can see this L block. This would be the placement and tack down of the batting, and then this would be the trim guide and the tack down of the fabric. And so I want my block to look more like that instead of just one. You can see there's just one outline. There's not that extra outline. So the first thing I'm going to do is select that block, come to Utility and Center and Hoop. Now I need to go to this right hand side. I'm going to select that third step, which is the tack down of the fabric, and I need to enlarge that by 1/2 of an inch, and that will put 1/4 inch around all of the sides for my seam allowance. So right now it's 5 inches. I need it to be 5.5. And because this lock is on, it will change both. And so I will select just that, and I always, when I make any sort of changes, I like to come back to Utility and Center in the Hoop just to make sure. Sometimes when you do change a size, it might be off very slightly, but I always want to double check that. So now if I look at this, I've not changed anything about the stitch out of this block except one thing. I have the placement of the batting. I'll put my batting down. I am going to cut my batting larger. So the second step is to tack the batting down, which I am going to do. Normally I don't. I'll trim the batting. I'll place the fabric over, and then I will run the tack down of the fabric. It's just a little bit bigger, and that's again so that when I sew this together, I don't have a chance to see that stitching if I'm not super precise. Now with that being said, the next step would be the quilting. Now if you see, the quilting is also 5 by 5. Everything for these little pillows can be that 5 by 5 size, because it's going to be sewn by a machine, and that backing would sew exactly where it needed to sew, and there's no like human error. And so if I were to leave this quilting exactly a 5 by 5, that would also make a possibility that when I sew this to the block next to it, I might see all of the stitching if I'm not 100%. And so I am going to come over to the right hand side, select just the quilting. I can do that on this right hand side, and I am not going to make this 5.5 by 5.5. I don't want it as big as the tack down of the fabric, but I do want it to go slightly into the seam allowance. So I'm going to come up here and change this to 5.25. I'm going to go to Utility and Center and Hoop just to make sure. And so now if we look, this dark blue is the batting. Then this would be the tack down of the fabric. This, between those two, is my 1/4 inch. I'll trim along this outside stitching, sew essentially right here, and now my quilting goes into the seam allowance. So if I don't, again, sew perfect, that I don't have a chance of seeing all of this trowel lines that the quilting needs to quilt this background. And so that's all I need to do with this block. That's pretty easy. And so I've already saved mine. If we go back and look at this, this is exactly, you can see the same thing. And so, and obviously you've seen I've already stitched it out. So that's all I need to do for that block. So if I hadn't saved it, I would either put this on a new page or delete these so I could save just this design, and I would save it and then add it to my USB so I could take it to my machine. Right now, since I've already saved it, I'm going to go ahead and delete so I can just get it off of my page so I can work on the next one. So now the next design is, of course, similar, but it has some borders. This has the two borders. So there's a centerpiece of fabric, whereas the skull just had, one background fabric and then the applique. This has the orange as the background, and then it has two borders. And so there's going to be a little bit different steps, but they're just easy. Again, the first thing I'm going to do is come to the right hand side and scroll all the way to the bottom to the very last step, which is that tack down of the envelope backing. I don't need that, so I'm going to hit delete. I'm going to go back up, and we've got the placement and the tack down of the batting. I want to keep those the same. And then it has the placement for that orange inside border. I need that. Then it's going to have to tack that orange, center down. I need that. It's going to run a placement line too for that little inner white border. This is a flip and fold, so it'll run these 2 stitch lines. I'll place my fabric right side down. The next would be to stitch that down, flip, and do that again for the outside border. Then finally on the 9th step, this outside border would tack all of that fabric down. You definitely need all of that tacked down. But this is where I need to change it to be bigger so that, again, I don't have a chance that stitching would show, because this will become my seam, and I need to make it bigger so that I don't see that. So right now this is 7 by 5, and I need to add a 1/2 inch so that it will be 1/4 inch all the way around. Now this little lock I need to unlock because these aren't the same ratio, so I can't just change one like I did the skull. So I'll come to the 7 and add 0.5, and since it's unlocked it only changes that one. And then the 5, I'll go 0.5, so it's 5.5. And now I need to center this. Now I didn't center this when I brought it over, so I'm going to click off and then click back on the entire block, come up to utility and center in the hoop. Now I'm going to go back to that step 9 to make sure it's centered, because I added and changed the dimensions and it wasn't the same ratio. I changed them with this little lock unlocked. So I will come to utility and center in hoop just to make sure it looks like it was centered. So now it looks like, everything's great. I have this outside border like I do with my Kimberbell, but I still have all of these placement lines for the fabrics, and the borders still end right here inside. And if I just want to make them extend and be the same width, it doesn't have to be perfect, as that outer tack line, just so that it extends the stitching. So I'm going to come back up to this 3rd step, which is the placement for that orange inside fabric. And I am just going to pull this and stretch it. I can, if I want to look and try to stretch it to the outside, it does. Again, this one doesn't have to be perfect. I just want it bigger than what it is now. So I'll stretch this side. But the important thing with these is I don't want to change the placement on the top and the bottom. I can't just select this and make this a little bit bigger, because then it would make the top and the bottom bigger, and I don't want that. I need the orange inner fabric to be the same height. I just want to extend it so that I'm, matching my tack down of my fabric. So I hope that makes sense. So now I need to do the same thing with the tack down. This was the placement of that orange fabric. So I'll select the next step and just drag it out so it's about at this outer tack down line that I just made. I'll just drag this out a little bit. Again, not touching the top and bottom. This is only stretching the width. Same thing with the border. I'm going to take this placement for that little white border, stretch it out on both ways. Take the next one, which would be the tack down, stretch it out. Again, I always want to leave them the same top and bottom. Do the same thing with the next one. And then there's one more. And again, these don't have to be perfect. If they're just shy of, you know, this line, if it even goes over, that's fine. I just don't want them to be where this placement of the batting is, because that will eventually be my seam allowance. And I just want to stretch them all out. Now with this one, if I go down to, after it tacks that whole fabric down, I made that bigger. The next thing is the quilting. Now if you look, this quilting does not go into the seam allowance like the skull did, and so I don't need to change this because you know, it will go up, and this is kind of just a meandering background quilting. If I'm not quite as perfect in my seam allowance for this quilting, it won't matter, just because it's kind of just, you know, a random. So I'm not even going to do anything with that quilting. And that's fine. So that's all I need to do for this one. Again, I'm just changing this to be a little bit bigger size. So when I click on this, the final size will now be 1/2 inch larger than it was originally. It's 7.5 by 5.5. So when I go back and look at my one that I put together for my quilt, I will line that up, of course, and that will make it easy to trim. All right, so I have one more, and that's the bat. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this since I've already saved it, and come back and do the same with the bat. Now the bat is pretty much the same as the spooky. I'm going to center that in the hoop. The first thing I'm going to do is scroll to the bottom and select that last that tacks the envelope down and hit delete. I'm going to scroll back up, and I want to leave the placement for the batting and the tack down of the batting the same. Then it does one border. It's going to be a piece border, and so I want the sides to be the same, because if I adjust these sides, then it will affect the width of the border. So on the bat, because it's a vertical block, I need to adjust the height. But before I adjust that, I want to come down and adjust that final tack down of the fabric and add the 1/2 inch, which would give the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So right now it's a 6 by 6. I'm going to go ahead and lock this lock, since it's a square block, and add 0.5. So now this becomes 6.5 by 6.5, which was the same as the owl block. And that, when they're sewn together, that will make about a 12 inch finished block. So now that I've got that done, I can go back to the placement for the border. Again, because this is a vertical block, I don't want to adjust these two on the side. I only want to extend it a little bit out from the top and the bottom on this one. And then the tack down, the same thing. I'll just extend it from the top to the bottom. And that's just because I want my stitching to go out to where I have the fabric tacked down. I don't want it to end short and then not have that stitched. And then with this one is the same meandering, and I don't need to make that larger like I did the skull. If I see a little bit, if I don't sew my seam exactly, you know, perfect on this outer border, it really won't matter, because it's just kind of a random background. So now that this one is done, it is a 6.5 by 6.5. So if I go back to my original, now you can see that these have all, let me move this back. Now they all fit together as my little mini quilt. So I hope that that makes sense. I could have just deleted the last step, which is that envelope backing, and if I left everything else the same, I could trim it bigger. Again, the reason I am choosing to do the tack down larger is so that when I sew these together, there might be a possibility that that tack down of that fabric, since it was the same size and will be right where I sew these blocks together, I might have a chance of seeing them. If you look at this, if I didn't make the tack down of this fabric bigger when I sewed these two together, I might have seen stitching down either or both of these blocks if my seam, wasn't perfect. So I hope that I'm explaining that. This would be something that you wouldn't have to do. You would just, maybe be a little bit cautious when you're sewing it together so you don't see that. Or if you do see a little bit of stitching, I guess that's not a big deal either. I always like to try to do different things on Embrilliance and kind of learn what I can do to adjust a design. And so this is what I decided to do for this one. All right, so now that I've got all these designs, of course, I saved them all completely separate. You don't want to save this together because you wouldn't be able to stitch them separate. So when I made the changes, I saved each one, by itself, and I added it to my USB. All right, so now that that's done, and I hope that I haven't just totally confused you, let me show you how I am going to prepare my fabric. I would make a change, and I put this in the next part, but this pieced block or border that goes on the bat, I added some iron-on interfacing to the back. I added that to all of my fabrics, including the border on the spooky block, this white and black border. I would add that if I were to do this again. I like the strength and the smoothness that iron-on interfacing gives. However, if I would have thought a little bit more through for this pieced block, I would not have added the interfacing, and that's only because the orange and the black strips are sewn together, then they're cut apart and sewn vertical. So each of these are sewn together, so there is a seam and it's got the backing, and so it made it quite thick, and so that's the only thing that I would change. For this project, I am putting a iron fusible interfacing on the back of all of the fabrics. That's really not what the directions call for, but I'm going to do that. I usually do that when I do things like Kimberbell or Lori Holt. So I am doing that with all of these pieces. So I have just a roll similar to stabilizer. It's just an iron-on interfacing. And what I do is just lay the roll out and then just kind of puzzle my pieces together the best I can. Here's one little piece that didn't get covered, and I will put a pressing sheet when I show you how I adhere the backing. Right now they're just on, you can tell they're not ironed. I ironed with the tiny iron just to get them so that they would hold good enough for me to cut apart. But you can see that they're not ironed yet. There's a little tiny piece that's ironed, but for the majority they're really not ironed. So I just cut pieces and just laid them out the best, that made sense, so that I used the least amount of the interfacing, and then I have cut them apart and I'm ready to press. So let me show you how I'm going to press these instead of just ironing. Now you can use just a regular iron. When I use an iron, I usually do use best press. I will, start by pressing the front. I'll flip it over, spray with a little best press, really press from the back, and turn it over and press again. And it does take a lot of pressing with an iron. And when I have a lot to do, then I'm going to show you how I do it instead. And then after I get these all pressed, I'm going to show you how I determined what size fabric to cut, because I am not making these into the little pillows and I'm making this into the wall hanging. I needed to make them just a little bit larger, and I'll show you how I determined the size after doing all of that in the embroidery software. All right, so let's get these pressed on and then I'll cut these apart. I have my HTV Ront heat press and it slides open and closed and it's super easy to set. I am doing 320 for 15 seconds, but to set the temperature, you would just hit this button and then you could change, hit the clock, and that changes the time. And then it beeps when it's ready, and then the R is the start button. It does have a removable little like Teflon sheet. It's got a non-stick top. And so what I do, the adhesive is face up. I'm going to press it down, and because I have a few little areas that might not have been cut perfect and might have a little bit, hanging over, I am going to take a silicone mat, a Teflon sheet, and just put it over the top. And let me see if it's big enough to do both of these. This is a 15-inch by 15-inch area to heat press. And I think that just fits. You could use a larger one. I have a larger one that I have a bigger heat press. That's just a white, super large. In fact, maybe I'll do that just to make sure that I'm covering all. Then I will push this in, push the R, and it will automatically go down, and it will heat press it for as long as you have it set. And then once it's off, it will open back up. So you can walk away and it will open back up. So then once that's done, it is all nice and heat pressed. You can see that, this isn't lifting up like it was. It's got nice even pressure, and it's so fast, so much faster than ironing. So let me get my next pieces. So again, you can see that these aren't really, I just barely tacked them so that I could move them and not have them fall off. But they are, not really, other than just in a few spots lightly tacked on. So I will go ahead and use my large mat, because then I know it's completely covered. Push this in, and we'll get this heat pressed. Ooh, and that's super hot. And so here we are. All of it's nicely heat pressed. Looks good. You could always, turn it over if you wanted to, double check or just make sure, but you can see how good that looks now. All right, I have one left. And this one you can see doesn't really fit. I mean, it hangs off the edges a little bit. So what I'm going to do is pull part of it just so it's over, since I have to do 2 pressings. One isn't going to be enough. And I will just press it and do the first half. Now, of course, if I had a super long, let's say I had a width of fabric and I needed to do a whole bunch of things, I could have my whole roll of stabilizer just, as long as I needed it. And then I could do it in multiple sections. So this first part is done, and it is super hot. And remember, this little piece right here is just the adhesive, and so that's one reason it's I like to use the Teflon on top, even if I don't have any other things, just in case any of that adhesive is showing. So now this half is done, so I'm just going to move it over, and then I'll do the second half, and then I'll be done. is. All heat pressed and ready to go. Let me cut these apart and tell you how I determined what size I cut on my background. I cut everything apart just with scissors. It's super fast. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can see on this one there's a little bit of something that was next to it. All of these are either the background fabrics or applique pieces, and so they are going to be trimmed when I'm done with the applique or with the block. The only ones that I am going to trim with a rotary cutter, and that's just to make sure that I get any of the edges that have a little bit of stabilizer trimmed neatly, are the borders. These fabrics right here are borders, and even though I will put them on a placement line, I still want to make sure that I'm straight, and so I will just clean these up with a rotary cutter. I have everything trimmed, and I'm just going to briefly go over how I determined how big to cut my pieces of fabric. Now, in the directions, they do list, the fabric and the sizes. And of course, you can go by that. I am making mine just a little bit bigger because I am not making these into pillows. Now, the only diagram that they have is the backing, which would become the envelope back to, complete the little pillow. And so I am used to Kimberbell. I do a lot of Kimberbell, and they always give diagrams for all of their cutting. And so it was a little bit different to have to figure out, what fabric, how big. Anyways, it's doable. But I had to make some changes because, of course, if you watched the software part of the video, you know that I made these a little bit bigger. So first, I just pulled from my stash. This is all of the Pumpkins and Potions fabric from that ladder quilt that I pulled out. I purchased this, and it did come as either just a pattern or the pattern and the fabric kit. When I purchased this, they didn't have any kits left, and so I'm just having to use my own kit. So these are my own fabrics. So these are not the fabrics used in the samples. Now, I don't know if this is a new pattern. I don't know if this is years old. I'm not really sure. I do know that the kit came with everything pre-cut, laser cut, kind of like you would do on a scan and cut. The little ghost, all the wording, the bats, the eyes, the skull, everything that was an applique came pre-cut. I am having just to do regular applique. Now, the great thing about this project is it gives you two files. It gives you one file if you have things pre-cut, and that, I guess, would be whether you bought the kit with the pre-cut items or if you were to cut your own with a scan and cut, for example. They have one file, and that is with like a blanket stitch around. And they do not include the SVG files to cut on your scan and cut or silhouette or Cricut. But, of course, there's ways to do that if you have a machine that has capabilities of sending something to a scan and cut, for example. But that's, for another time. And then they have a second file that is for traditional applique, which is what I'm doing. So in order to figure out the size that I need, I kind of went by this side and just made them a little bit bigger. So for example, my owl block did not come from this kit. It came from Pumpkins and Potions. And so I was able just to cut according to the directions in Pumpkins and Potions. However, I just pulled scraps. These were scraps that came, that I keep everything. And I did not cut these down to size. These are just, what I had cut and put inside the extras. And these happen to fit perfect. This will be for the stomach of the owl, and this is for the little stand. And so those I just had, again, the background fabric I just cut. It just needs to be bigger than, my final trim size because it needs to be tacked down when I'm working on the block. So this outside line again will be what I trim my block to. So I just need it bigger than that. And you can see it's just, you know, 1/2 inch or so bigger. So that is for the owl block. It was also super simple to do the skull block because that's just pretty straightforward. The backing, I believe this is 5.5 inch trim size for me. That's what I made it. And so I think this would have been a 5 inch about for the pillow. So I cut this just an inch larger. So I cut this at 6.5. So I have a 1/2 inch hangover on each side. And then for the skull, this is from a charm pack on a quilt that I'm working on. And that fits just perfect. You can see I have enough to tack down and then trim. So this was just, you know, you can tell it was a charm pack. It's got that pinked edge. And then this was a scrap for my pumpkins and potions. I didn't cut it to size. It already had interfacing on the back. Or maybe I did interface this one. I think the other ones, anyways, it was a scrap, and that just, I just need something to fit over the eyes and nose. So he was pretty easy. So the next one, the spooky and the bats, are a little bit different because they both have some borders. So let me show you how I did those. So for the spooky, the first thing is I had this piece that I cut for a t-shirt. This is HTV, or heat transfer vinyl. It's the glitter vinyl. And this was just left over from something that I cut out for a t-shirt for somebody. And I am going to use this glitter for the ghosts. And I'm not going to cut it down. I'll just, when it's time to place this, I'll just place the circle, tack it down and trim it, and just, you know, put this back in my scraps. For the center piece, which is the orange piece of fabric that goes down the center of the pillow, I did the same height because I'm doing the front of my pillow the same height, which was in this case 4.5 inches. So I cut this 4.5 inches. I just cut it wider. I think theirs was, their directions said 8 inches. I cut mine, I think it's 9 inches because I needed it to go outside of my trim line. Remember, this was the original trim line, this inside line, that's where the pillow backing would have been put on. I added a seam allowance, and so I just made sure this was wider. It doesn't need to be taller because we're adding borders. So that's how I got the center. Now with this, with the words, these were the scraps. You can tell they've got some fraying that I pulled out of my pumpkins and potions fabric. They already had backing on it. And so because some of this, you know, has the selvage, and I didn't have quite a big enough piece to do the whole letter, I'll just use half, you know, half for one, half for the other. But those were just scraps that I'm using for the words. Now for the borders, there is a thin white border. I'll be up here. There's a thin white border, and then there is a black border. Now I cut, you know, again, the same, I think theirs was 1 inch. I cut 1 inch. I just cut it longer. Now this is even longer than the orange because the piece that I cut these two strips from happened to be this wide. And so I just cut, you know, I cut that off, and I'll just center it, and that'll be trimmed off. So for the black, again, I cut it the same width as the white. I just made it bigger. So instead of whatever the measurement said, I just needed to extend it, and I did it a little bit more to make sure that when this is placed, then the next border will go on, and then, you know, flipped, and then this one will be sewn on and flipped. I needed to make sure that I had plenty of room outside of my trim line to tack it down. So I made this, I think, 2 inches. So that's how I got the borders. I just made them, you know, a little bit wider. This one, because it's the end fabric, was a little bit taller as well. I hope this isn't, you know, totally confusing, but that's, I just put it over just to make sure that I have enough room to go past my tack down lines. So that is for the spooky. Then the last one for the bats is similar to the spooky. I did the center fabric, which is just this white center. I did that the same width because that's not going to change. It just needs to be taller because I'm going to, again, sew a seam allowance and make this into a block. So it's the same width that it's supposed to be. It's just taller. And I'll just, again, trim the excess. So the same thing with the borders. Oh, with the bats, I just measured the bat, and 3 by 5.5 is what I cut to just be able to place this, tack it down and trim it. I accidentally cut one to 2.5, and it's barely going to fit, but it will be good. I'll just have to be a little bit more careful placing that. And then the same with the border. These borders are going to be sewn together and made into kind of this little checker before it goes into the hoop. So I cut these to the width that they tell me. I just made them longer because when I sew these together, these are then cut apart, and then you sew them end to end to get this cute little checkerboard. And I need to make sure that when this is put on, it goes past my tack down and trim line. And so this might be confusing, and I had to think about this because I wasn't quite sure. These are to be cut 1/4 of an inch segments, and then you sew them together so that this strip would be 1 1/4 inch wide. I need mine to be a little bit longer to, again, go over my tack down and trimming line. So instead of 1 1/4 inch, I'm going to try 1 1/2 inch. It won't change the size of the square. It'll just give me extra room that hangs over that I will then trim off. And I'll try to show more of that because that's confusing. And I hope that, I figured that out right, since this does need to be a little bit bigger. So with all that being said, you just make everything a little bit longer than it needs to be. And let's see how this works. So we're going to stitch out. I'm going to start with the owl because the owl was a Kimberbell project, straightforward. I didn't make any changes. We'll start with that, then we'll go to the skull, and then do the ones with the borders. For the vinyl for the cloche that goes over the owl, so it looks like he's under a little glass cloche, I just need a small piece of vinyl. And I just have this vinyl that I got, a long time ago, just by the yard. It's, I don't know, got to be probably more than a yard long, just for, couches or beds or whatever. I just got this at Joann's. So I will just cut a piece off that's a little bit bigger and use that. And it's put on just like an applique that's cut, a raw edge applique. And that's what I'll use for the vinyl. The hoop I'm using is my 7 by 12, and I have my roll of stabilizer still attached. I have pulled out some slack so that when it's embroidering, nothing will get caught up and it's free to move. And the reason I'm using the stabilizer still attached is I'm just going to stitch these blocks one after another, keeping the stabilizer, again, attached and not cut until I have all 4 blocks done, and that will just help me save on stabilizer. Also, one more thing that I didn't mention was the batting. So I am just using some batting that I've had pre-cut. When I cut a whole bunch of Kimberbell projects, I'll just sometimes have leftovers. And so the way I'm going to figure out the batting is just by this inside line. And so for this owl, I have some that's already pre-cut that's exactly this size. And so this is something that I will do, as I've done with most of my Kimberbell projects, is I will do the placement line for the batting. I'll place the batting, and then I'll place the fabric and tack down the fabric. This will not have a tack down of the batting for this specific design because that's how I've done it. And I already had this design from my pumpkins and potions and didn't make any changes. So for the other ones, they do have tack down, and so I've just pulled batting that I think is a little bit bigger. So for example, the skull, the tack down and placement will be this inside line, and this piece of batting was extra, same size as I'm using for the owl, but you can see it's bigger. And so I will run the placement, place my batting, tack the batting down, and trim around right next to the tack down so that there is no batting in my seam allowance when I go to sew this block together. And it will kind of be the same for the other two. I had some 6x8 that I think is going to work. It's just, you know, a little bit bigger than this inside, which is going to be the batting. And then it's a little bit wider, quite a bit wider. And so I think for both of these, I'll just use this large piece that I had, and then again, I'll tack it down and trim it. All right, so that's how I'm doing the batting. I will go to embroidery and to my USB, and I've added a folder onto the USB that had my little beautiful neighborhood from Hoop Studios. Those are these first two folders. And so I have the spooky bow fillers, which I'm doing into a wall hanging. And then I have my owl cloche that I brought in for my pumpkins and potions. And then these are the 3 designs that I did earlier in Embrilliance. So I'm going to start with the owl. So I will select the owl and hit set. And I think I'm on my 7x12. I am. And because I have my stabilizer still attached and I want to put these together and save the most, I am going to go to edit. First, I'm going to go to embroidery. Then I'm going to go to layout and move. And I can move this all the way to the top. And it won't let me go outside of my stitchable area. So now this is all the way to the top, and I have all of this stabilizer at the bottom. Now I don't have enough room to add one of the other designs, but what I'll do is when this is done stitching, I will keep it attached to the strip of stabilizer, to the roll, and I will just move it up as close as I can get and rehoop, and I'll show that as I get more of these stitched out. But this again will just help me save on stabilizer. All right, so I'm going to select OK and go to the minus plus needle. And the first step is going to be the placement of the batting. I'm going to place my batting and then place my fabric, kind of centering over the batting, and then I'll run the tack down around the outside to hold the fabric down. Then I'll do the background quilting. So now the next few steps for the owl will be a little bit of embroidery. Then there will be some of the traditional applique where it will do a placement line. I'll place the fabric, tack it down and trim it. It will do some more embroidery, and then I'll stop and let you see how I'm going to do the clear vinyl, which is for part of the cloche. Although that's really just the same as a typical applique with one minor change. All right, so let's get to stitching the rest of this owl out. I'm on the last two steps of the owl cloche, and I need to place the vinyl and then tack it down. So there's a couple things that I'm going to do. First, I'm not sure if you can see, but this was kind of bent. You know, it's been kind of rolled and folded. And so I need to smooth this out, but I can't iron on it. So there's a couple things I can do. I can put my iron down, heat up, you know, the wool pad, or this is just some muslin, and then put this down and kind of spread it so that the heat will, you know, transfer and kind of flatten that out. I can also cover it with a pressing cloth and just lightly iron it. Now I'm not, you know, going to iron it too long. It's just to smooth and kind of relax that vinyl. And so it's ready to go. The other thing that I need to pay extra attention to is to make sure that there's no threads, you know, nothing on my vinyl, nothing on where it's going to go. If I have any sort of, you know, thread that I need to trim, any lint, anything, I need to take that off now. Now I do notice that on this little ear, there's kind of on one ear, there's a little spot that I can see the background. And I'm just going to take a Sharpie and I'm just going to kind of cover that up so it's not quite so visible. I think everything looks good. You could take a lint roller, but I think that looks good. I'm going to double check my vinyl. Make sure that there's nothing underneath, and I think that looks good. So give it one last look. I'm just going to make sure that it's placed or completely over the placement line, and then I'm going to tack it down. Now with vinyl, of course, it's super slippery, and so I am going to just put a couple pieces of tape. I could just try to, you know, hold it down with my little tool that I use, but I think, want to tape this. Okay, now it's time to tack this down. The last step is to embroider the little ball that goes on top of this little cloche. Now this is a raw edge applique, which means that there's going to be no other, you know, kind of decorative outline over this. And so when I trim the vinyl, I'm going to trim it about 1/8 of an inch or so away from the tack down line. I'm not going to do it super close like I would an ordinary applique. However, with that being said, I'm going to wait until this is out of my hoop to trim the entire thing. I think it's easier than trimming, you know, over the sides of the hoop. But I do need to trim along this top part because there is this ball that will be stitched. And so it goes down, you know, a little bit over this. And so I am going to trim just a little bit so that I can finish up that little ball. Now, of course, this is totally optional. You could just, you know, sit and trim this, but I like to, if at all possible, do that when it's out of the hoop. Well, I totally forgot to hit record, but it just stitched out this little top of the cloche, and you can see that my vinyl, you know, was out of the way and it was able to do that. So now all I'm going to do is just take my scissors and just, you know, cut again about 1/8 of an inch or so around this tack down so that it has, you know, a nice even edge all the way around. I've decided that I'm going to go ahead and break this into 2 videos. This is part A, and then I will stitch the other 3 designs in the next part, part B. Now to hoop for the next design, I have the owl still attached, and I'm putting just the edge of this fabric into the hoop so that I can, again, save on stabilizer. This is totally optional. Most people don't do this, but I'm gonna do it. So because I have a little bit of batting and the fabric, I just loosen my hoop just like half a turn to compensate for that extra thickness. Once I get it hooped, then I will just take the stabilizer and pull it towards the center, not up, because I don't want it to pull the frame out, but I'll kind of just tug in to make sure that I have it nice and ready to go. So now again, I have my roll. I'll tuck it under my arm and go to my machine. I have this still attached. And the most important thing when I'm putting this into my machine is that this is out and hanging off the back of my machine, that it doesn't, get caught under, and that wouldn't be good, because what I'm going to do is I will move up the next design again all the way to the top so that it can get as close, and then I'll just redo this for the others. All right, let's go ahead and start the skull. I have my hoop on, and I've made sure that this owl is not tucked under, and so now I'm going to come back and I'm done embroidering. I'll go to home. I can cancel that pattern, go back to embroidery and my USB, and go to my folder, and now I'm going to bring in the skull. I will hit set and embroidery, and then again I'm going to go to layout and move, and I'm going to move this all the way to the top, and that way I'll be as close to the top, saving the most stabilizer that I can. All right, so this is pretty straightforward as far as applique and quilting. This one will have the traditional tack down of the batting because I'm using a larger piece. All right, so let's start the skeleton. Again, if you're working on these designs, there are 2 files, one with the blanket stitch around the appliques, and that is for anything that is pre-cut, whether you got the kit or whether you have made your own pre-cut from, example, the Scan and Cut. You need to make sure you're following the correct directions. I am not using pre-cuts, and so as I go through the directions, I need to make sure that I'm following the correct, which is the satin stitch version. That is for the traditional applique. Do the placement line for the batting. I'm going to place my batting that is cut a little bit larger, tack it down, trim the batting, place the fabric, tack it down, and run the quilting and start on the skull. So when this started, this did not catch, and so I am going to go ahead and cut. And because it's going to go around again, I'm not going to go ahead and back up. This is a tack down, and it'll be tacked down enough, and then this will become our trimming guide. So it just did the placement for the skull, and I am going to place the fabric and just make sure I completely cover that. And then after tacking down, I will trim and do the same thing with the eyes.